this webinar, which is Welcome to the Center for International Higher Education, and welcome to this event, which is part of International Education Week at Boston College. Of course, 1 week was not enough for all of us to provide all of these different events and opportunities for exchange. So really, during the entire month of November, we are having a series of events throughout, well, really addressing the theme for International Education Week at Boston College, which is related to healing, to moving forward from the impact of the pandemic, but also to understanding equity and how it relates to internationalization of higher education. So I cannot think of a better theme for our webinar today to address these questions, but also the wonderful panel that we have put together. So once again, thank you very much. Welcome to the Center for International Higher Education. And we are very excited to welcome our panelists today. I'm just going to do some very quick housekeeping and then turn it over to our moderator for today, which, by the way, our moderator will be Dr. Ayenachew Woldegiyorgis, and he is a distinguished alum from the Center for International Higher Education. Welcome home, Ayu, and thank you for organizing this event. The only last remaining piece of business that I have for all of you is to ask that you pose your questions using the chat function at the bottom. You don't need to wait until the end of the presentations. You can do this at any point, and our facilitator will be addressing those questions by asking them out loud to our panelists. Finally, we ask that you remain muted throughout the duration of the webinar, and during the presentations, we ask also that you turn off your cameras. So without any further ado, welcome to this webinar. And Ayu, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Gerardo. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you also to CIHE for organizing this event. So we will be talking about our in progress book, which is close to its final stages now, Higher Education and the COVID-19 Pandemic, Cross-National Perspectives on Challenges and Responses. In a moment, Professor Fulu is going to give us a general background of how we came about this book and how it is progressing. Before I do that, I would like to introduce my colleagues. We are editing this volume, the three of us, who is Professor Fulu Netswera being the lead. Professor Fulu Netswera is a professor of higher education at the Durban University of Technology, Faculty of Management Sciences. And also we have Dr. Tatiana Karabchuk, who is an associate professor in the Department of Government and Society at the UAE University. Before we move into today's presentation, I would like to make two remarks, which is generally kind of sending a message of the obvious. The first thing is that when we are talking about the impact of COVID-19 on higher education and so on, it's important to remember that we are still in the pandemic, and we are not assuming by any means that we have a full grasp of how and to what extent the pandemic has affected higher education in any particular context. And so we need to understand all the discussions within that frame, that we are still in this challenge, in the middle of this challenge, and you have seen what is happening in many parts of the world in the past few days, like in Europe, for instance, where there is still an uptick of cases. The other thing we would like to note is that we are also discussing this broad idea within the context of a number of other changes in many countries, in countries like Indonesia, Ethiopia, Turkey, South Africa, and so on. There have been major reforms already happening within the sector of higher education and also in the broader political environment. And the pandemic happened in the middle of all these changes happening. And so we're not claiming that it would be easy and straightforward to distinguish between what is caused by the pandemic and what is caused by other factors that were already going on. So in many of these cases, the response to the pandemic was integrated with the ongoing changes. And so we are dealing with very complicated contexts in many cases. So we just wanted to underline these two before we proceed into our discussions. So now we are, the way we plan to do this is we are going to take the first 20-25 minutes to give a broad summary of generally introducing the book and the major questions it's trying to address, how we organized it, and so on, and also highlighting a few of the major findings. And then we will open for question and answer. And if you have any questions, any comments, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat. I will be following that while Professor Fulu and Dr. Tatiana would be covering the first part of the presentations. So with that, I will first lead to Professor Fulu to take the first part of the presentation.
Thank you very much, Aye. Yes, thank you, colleagues, and afternoon from South Africa, from the city of Durban. Now, just to give you some background and idea about the book, being a member of the executive of the university at the Durban University of Technology, and as soon as the pandemic hit us, that was in March of last year, 2020, I started realizing there's quite a lot that is changing in a very short space of time. And I thought it would be prudent that one documents what is really going on. And at that stage, indeed, one had no idea that the pandemic was going to last this long. So I looked around to scholars who are researching in related areas on higher education policy, higher education reforms, and I came across Aye. Aye linked me with other people, and other people linked themselves with the rest of the team that we currently have. And we formulated a number of questions. We realized there are massive disruptions that are happening in higher education, and therefore one has got to account for these disruptions and the ultimate outcome that emerges out of this pandemic. We also did acknowledge early in 2020 that UNESCO released a statement citing that this might have been the biggest game changer in as far as education is concerned, education provision throughout the world. And as you can see, the figures of the effect or impact that COVID has had on higher education in particular and general education throughout the world, this has been one of the biggest disruptors. And therefore, one has to ask questions about how this crisis is going to be managed going forward. So we realize there have been lockdowns of campuses, lockdown on countries, and that in itself, once again, affect universities throughout the globe, including those that receive international students. The transition into online learning has caught a lot of countries, a lot of institutions unawares, and therefore it means that we operated under the situation of crisis. So it's been crisis management since March or so of last year. And one has got to look at how do we manage this crisis in higher education as higher education institutions. If you can move to the next slide. Yeah, so we ask quite a lot of questions regarding COVID and lockdown, regarding how higher education institutions have been managing the challenges, regarding the intersection between governments and higher education institutions in managing COVID, but equally so in making sure that higher education institutions continue to operate by other means, and how higher education institutions have been able to continuously fund themselves, private and public institutions, and how priorities of government, which have been changing because of COVID, have compromised the provision for higher education delivery. So we've got all of these questions that we've been asking ourselves, and we thought it is important that we go to institutions, we look to different countries, and find out if there are particular methodologies by which institutions and countries have responded to these critical questions. The next slide, Tatiana. So all in all, we ended up with 22 countries represented. Initially, we had a little bit more, but there are a few other countries that dropped out. And as you can see, there is broad representation of all the continents in this particular book. And we pleased that although this is not per se an empirical study, it nevertheless gives us a very good idea anecdotally at some level, but equally empirically at other levels, because you will realize there are some countries that went and did some empirical research here and there. Then it gives us a very good idea of how individual countries, some individual institutions have responded. Although we must say upfront that our focus has been not on individual institutions per se, but how countries and the higher education sectors within those countries have responded to the challenge of COVID-19. If you can move on, Tatiana. Now, once we received the contributions and the suggested chapters, this is what we managed to do. We looked at the emerging themes from the various countries, and we grouped them together, and we ended up with these 4 major themes. We looked at the theme of opportunities and challenges for higher education in the times of global pandemic. We looked at the theme of management of higher education under crisis. We looked at the theme of governance of higher education during the global pandemic. And lastly, we looked at the financial challenges for public and private higher education institutions. What one would realize as you start reading the book is that although we tried to group these contributions into various themes, nevertheless, the contributed chapters do cut across mainly all the themes or most of the themes, so that you don't look for only the impact of on the financial impact on institutions, only on those that are found in part 5. You will find that those in part 1 and part 2 do articulate some of the financial challenges and crises around that. So, but although the main focus of those within the themes is exactly the theme itself, but nevertheless, there are areas that do indeed cut across all these chapters. Thank you. You can proceed from there, Tatiana.
Yes, good morning, dear colleagues, or good evening if you are in other part of the world. So, indeed, I think that Professor Fulu already covered the idea about the book, and it's clear what are the focuses for the main parts, and what we were thinking to do in terms of representing some findings. We would be actually giving some highlights of main interesting results from different countries so that we could actually sparkle your interest to read the book and ask some more questions that we will be happy to answer. So, for example, if we look at Oman, and that chapter was dedicated mainly for the challenges and how their new country, because Oman is quite a young country, 50 years old, plus minus, as well as UAE. And it's a different part of the world, GCC area. So how come the global pandemic reflected on the education there, which was under the stage of reforms and under the stage of how to say it, reinforcing the high quality of the education. So, and you can see that indeed it was like emergency mode for the main institutions, and it was like emergency mode of transitioning to online learning, and the experience was quite satisfactory at the end. However, we could see that indeed it's like a good push for us to start thinking about the better options for the teaching and learning under the crisis. So indeed, it has a major effect. This pandemic had a major effects on the unexpected future in terms of how higher education institutions can prepare and learn to survive on the unexpected consequences. So if we look at another interesting results about institutional autonomy, for example, so during the pandemic, so these are examples from Ukraine, Turkey, South Africa, Argentina. So we could see that how pandemic actually shifted the balance of power differently. So for different countries, to the from the center to the local administrations, and vice versa. So actually, example of Kazakhstan could also be here. So from post-Soviet space, we had like two countries, Ukraine and Kazakhstan. And indeed, this this shift to of the efforts would allow the local administration to meet their social and economic demands, and to come up with some kind of autonomy to reflect to for the COVID-19 situations. So if we look at for example, such countries as Colombia and Latin America. So it's a quite different system, government system and higher education system. It's a completely different story. So we could see that this is these higher education institutions under high risk of actually being in need, and actually the higher education sector needs to be more organized for the future crisis. So they faced a lot of challenges that they could not overcome immediately, and indeed the support from the government was not as much put into the power as it would be expected. And the main recommendation, for example, from this chapter, we could see that the government must include some kind of strategic planning as a priority, because the institutions faced severe crisis consequences. So another story that was also discussed in the chapters was the difference between private and public sector institutions. I think it's a specific interesting issue especially under the pandemic, because if it's a governmental institutions, usually they receive some kind of support from the government, and it's easier for them, the guidance. But the private institutions were actually left alone by themselves. And for that's why it's interesting to look at the South Korea case, because majority of the institutions are there private. And this chapter allows us to see the financial situation in that sector, and it might be perceived that these institutions are having like a financial safety net because of ongoing the government and corporate financial support or steady stream of tuition revenue tied to wide enrollment pools, both domestic and international. But unfortunately, COVID-19 revealed some challenges um, for the private and public institutions, especially based on the rural locations. So, which actually leads to understanding that they do not have enough resources to fight against such unexpected crisis. So, Fulu, you want to continue with the findings?
Okay, that's fine, Tatiana.
Yes.
So here is another emerging theme from the findings, which information could easily be traced in Argentina, Australia, and Japan. And we find quite a lot of universities in these countries are highly dependent on international student mobility, especially Japan and Australia in the main. And once the COVID hit and international students were no longer able to travel, then it became quite a crisis. Now the sustainability of some of those universities is called to question now. We don't know how they will survive. There are institutions, for argument's sake, whose student population of nearly 30% to 50% is international students. And one wonders what would happen to those universities if online learning becomes the norm and student mobility is continuously fading away. But much more importantly, what would happen to student experiences, because student mobility is associated with experiences of being in other countries and not just learning from institutions in other countries, but being there, feeling the culture and mingling with the people, you know, so that becomes very important. And those are important questions that we need to contemplate, especially for those institutions that are hit hard. Now, what we also realize is that governments in some cases, in some countries, took center stage in addressing COVID-19 and its challenges. To an extent that in some instances, government usurped the powers of higher education institutions, calling into question the question of the autonomy, which we raised earlier on. We've got examples of cases where government went an extent of even procuring learning devices. Government went an extent of purchasing data for online learning for students. Government rolled out COVID-19 vaccines in some of the campuses, et cetera, but also government introducing new policies that indicates how you are going to behave as higher education institutions or as a sector going forward and under these conditions. So that becomes very clear in the case of Turkey. It's not limited only to Turkey and South Africa, colleagues. You can find traces of that in other countries. Argentina, for argument's sake, there is something along those lines. If you can go to the next slide. Tatiana? Okay. Now, this is an important theme And this theme does cut across many countries. I would assume even you delegates who are in this meeting have equally been grappling with this in your own institutions. And I would assume it is worse in the sectors and in institutions where online learning became the mode of delivery for the first time. That the quality of teaching or learning or online, that the assessments online got compromised, that synchronous, asynchronous learning had to be redefined completely. And some institutions had to start procuring such applications for proctoring to make sure that cheating is minimized. We've got practical examples of where this has been happening and the implication or effect that this has had in some of the participating case countries. Over to you, Tatiana.
Yes, actually, you already said it all. So I think that we want just to have some concluding remark or observations, right? So if you allow me to make that. Actually, all the 22 chapters are very interesting, and they focus in on a particular story of a country, and from them we can learn experiences, of course, of higher education worldwide, how they are coping with the crisis. But all in all, we can actually see some kind of tendencies and patterns that that would be common to many countries, right? So, and definitely the impact and effect of COVID-19 on the economic, social, and specifically higher education sectors across the world continues to be a story in making. So we are actually right now living in that. It's not finished. For example, in the UAE, we are still half online, half face-to-face. And if it's a big classes, we're still teaching online, and only small classes we're teaching face-to-face and only 50% capacity. Yes, what was the common thing actually that we can see for many countries? Definitely it was an very urgent emergency transition towards online education. And different countries faced was a different speed of adaptation. So, for example, in some poor countries like Kazakhstan, it was really a big problem for many students to have a good internet access, so that, especially in the remote areas, in the rural areas, and computers, enough computers to all the students. And that was the main challenge. So in some other countries, the main challenges were the lack of funds from tuition fees, because of big proportion of the international students, and they didn't know what to do with the current international students who were like left the country for the vacation and they couldn't come back. And like Australia or Japan. And yes, what are the main issues that associated with the higher education challenges right now? I think that it's very common for everyone and for many higher educational institutions. It relates, first of all, to quality of learning online. So this is an issue for many institutions. And definitely the issue about autonomy. So how much governments should allow institutions of higher education to take decisions on their own, and how much it should be controlled by the government. So for example, in Kazakhstan and Russia, or like UAE, it was totally controlled by the government. There is no autonomy at all for the universities almost. So higher education as also it's a question right now. Still, it will remain the catalyst for international mobility, or something will be changing after this experience. So how much universities will be paying attention to the international students right now? So will they build their policies um, and say revenues completely based on the number of international students, or they will diversify their policies and etc. and enrollments, resources. So these are the questions that are actually more or less common to many universities and many higher educational institutions across the world. So I think that we are, if Fulu or Ayo wants to add something to the concluding remark, because Ayo is also having the rights of the editor to add some points, I think, if he wants to.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Tatiana and Fulu. I think this was a very succinct summary of the major findings related to preparedness to move to online learning, which was an option that was taken by all higher education systems, as we know, and also about how institutional autonomy was at the center of the relationship between government and institutions, and also between central governments and local governments in terms of how they, the different countries approached the pandemic or their responses to the pandemic. The issue related to risk preparedness in higher education institutions, and the way in which some institutions, most institutions, in fact, were caught by surprise when the pandemic hit. And so there was little to none preparation to respond to it. And so everybody had to grapple with the situation that they were faced. You've also raised issues related to international student mobility and how that was that has a serious impact for some of the institutions that were very much reliant on income that is generated from international students. And we are still seeing the impact because travel restrictions are in place in many places as of now, and that it's also likely that to have a lasting impact in that regard. You've also raised some pointers about the assessment and quality in some higher education contexts. There was a general perception already that online education is of less quality than in-person education, but that is not the only factor. Depending on the nature of the specific discipline that you are considering, some areas of the study require practical exposure for students, going to the labs or doing some form of internship and so on. So fields like in the medical education, for instance, were seriously affected in terms of having the possibility for students to have practical exposures as part of their study programs. And all those called the quality of the programs into question. So we're getting some questions. One of the questions was raised by Rebecca, who asked it about, so she said, I've heard less about how COVID has affected government institutional relationship by increasing or decreasing autonomy. This strikes me as a very important contribution of your work. Can you say more about what seems to have affected that shift? Why some countries shifted towards the center and why others went in the opposite direction? I think earlier it has been remarked that we have had cases of both kind in some countries like Turkey, Ethiopia, South Africa. There was a need for a more streamlined and centrally coordinated response, in which case, therefore, the centrally mandated body, whether that is the ministry or any other government body or an ad hoc body, was given much power to give directions as to how institutions would have to respond to specific issues. And on the contrary, there were cases like in Ukraine, for instance, where the central government was challenged by local governments. Local administrative bodies had a much stronger hold on giving directions to their higher education institutions in their respective areas, and so it was difficult. But as to the why, I'm not quite sure if we have any direct response to that. I think this fits into how different countries chose to address the pandemic. One other factor that has to be noted in this regard is also the emergence of new bodies in the governance structure in general. Bodies like health authorities, for instance, which were not traditionally considered to be major stakeholders in the governance of higher education, had a lot of say because the pandemic being mainly a public health issue, health authorities were given an enormous amount of power to influence how countries and specific institutions would have to respond, what to do, what not to do, and so on. We can also think of, for instance, telecom companies, which were asked and which coordinated with the other government bodies to provide online education. In many countries, there were cases of efforts to provide internet access free of charge for students to be able to access online education. And so they also became part of the overall governance structure, and they leverage a significant amount of power. This is in addition to, of course, the emergence of a number of ad hoc committees and task forces that were composed of different government and non-government bodies, and that somehow brought about a new dimension into how governance in higher education took place, and also this relationship between national governments or central governments and local governments vis-a-vis government and higher education institutions broadly. Is there anything you would like to add, Tatiana or Fulu, on this particular point?
Yeah, I have actually. Yeah. Okay. After Fulu.
Okay. Thank you, Tatiana. Perhaps just to say that the autonomy arrangements between government and higher education have been different from country to country, even before COVID. And you can see that in some countries, this drastically changed as COVID hit. But in some countries, the relationships, or rather the autonomy of the higher education institutions seem to have remained intact. And we should equally acknowledge that not every chapter paid attention to autonomy and the relationship between government and higher education institutions. Suffice to say, it got worse in some countries. There are practical examples where you will find that higher education institutions in their individuality and the higher education executives could no longer say anything that relates to how students can be brought back to campus, including going an extent of dictating how online learning will be rolled out coming from government. So that has been very, very interesting to note. Tatiana, you can go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add, for example, bring in an example of Kazakhstan, so which is actually having a very good standards for education, but when it comes to the emergency situation of switching towards online mode, the government released just very broad guidelines how to do it, but they give a total autonomy for the institutions to adjust to this situation and control. There was no control for online education and so on. So actually the institutions were free to choose what kind of programs, to what extent the education would be put online. However, like in normal life, before pre-COVID life, there was a clear guidance and of course accreditation committees and everything. So how to control for the quality of education. So I also wanted to invite, if I see Edward is with us. He was actually an author for the South Korea case. Maybe he could also would like to add here on this question, because his chapter was about exactly very close related issue on private and government institutions. If IU allows, I don't know if Edward is with us and he would like to jump in. And
I'm not sure if he can hear us. Yeah. Anyway, a question related to that, Edward. If you want to comment, you can jump in anytime. A related question, actually two questions, which are somehow connected to this idea of relationship between government and institutions. One question is, how has whatever we have seen during this past year and a half has influenced the demand for accountability? That's one question. And another related question from Chris is, can you comment on how the operational disruptions has translated to shifts in how governments began to think about funding models of higher education? Any indicators of shifts in the political economy of higher education with these national contexts? Would like to, yeah,
it's fun. Let me start here by saying there has been demand for accountability at different levels in different countries. For argument's sake, we saw in the case of the USA that students had immediately demanded that in some institutions that students, their tuition fee be reimbursed. I think it also equally emerged in other cases, and students had to be reimbursed their tuition. There have been dropouts for the academic year 2020. So there have been those challenges. There's equally been accountability in terms of relevance of research, where we found institutions engaged in relevant research that relates to COVID-19. And participating in producing not only vaccines, but equally so other PPEs. So there've been that level of accountability that I can immediately recall from some of the chapters. If there are additional accountability issues that anyone wants to add, you can add. But perhaps before I stop there, to say that in the case of assessments, accountability for the quality of higher education provision, teaching and learning, institutions have tried their best in some instances, in some countries, to implement a variety of measures to make sure that the quality of teaching and learning is not compromised. And I can recall specifically the example of South Africa, where assessments for exit students had to be done face-to-face for all exit students. So yes, indeed, there's been compromises. There's been cheating going on with all other levels, but for exit students, they had to sit down and do a face-to-face examination. So there's been indeed accountability at different levels for different things. Thank you. I
think one thing that can be noted here is that there's also the case in some contexts whereby higher education institutions during this pandemic were much more actively involved in social issues. They were participating in undertaking research in the development and production of PPEs, creating public awareness and engaging in a number of different kinds of community services. This was, for instance, the case in Ethiopia and in many other African countries. So this idea of universities as being completely detached from their localities and being in this ivory tower was practically challenged, which could also translate into, going forward into accountability, into having universities being more open to social issues and addressing the challenges that come in their localities. I think that's another interesting development that we can anticipate to translate into accountability in higher education and institutions. So another question we have is related with assessment of students' learning. Do you see a need or opportunity for different kinds of assessment of student learning in the context of COVID? So this somehow relates to what Fulu was saying about face-to-face versus online assessment approaches. And in some of the cases, there were significant challenges to ensure that examinations like exit exams are being carried out with integrity. I think one interesting case we could mention is the case from Nepal. What they did in Nepal is rather than approaching every student in the same way, they started by classifying the students in terms of how much access they have for technology. And so they identified 5 different groups: those who have no access to technology, those who can access only radio, only TV, those who have different digital instruments like digital tools like computers, but not necessarily proper internet connection, and those that have access to internet as well. And then they used different mechanisms to approach this. So for those students who do not have, for instance, any access to technology, they used campuses with all the precautions being observed. They brought the students and some educational volunteers to provide them with physical books and notes and so on, and to assist them in person, while the others who could have access to other types of technology also were addressed in the particular way that is suitable for their circumstances. And what came with that is that in Nepal, the government made it a requirement that every student has to be assessed in at least 3 different ways. So assessment was diversified to make sure that students are getting a fair chance of being assessed in something. The traditional way was just to go for exams. Just students go in person for in-person exams, but that is not possible for everyone. And so when that shifts to some form of online assessment, then some students would be disadvantaged. And to counter that, they proposed that multiple methods of assessment be in place. I think this gives us a very important lesson going forward, that this is something that we can carry in the future, that a student is, due to a number of different reasons, not only because of technology, but also other reasons, because of their background is in lower level education, because of their living circumstances and so on and so forth, have different kinds of challenges that would call for different approaches in the way that we deliver education, as well as in the way that we try to assess their competency. So that is one very interesting example we can refer to when it comes to assessment, for instance. Anything to add from your side, Tatiana or Fulu?
I think you've addressed that one. Maybe we can, I see there are many others.
Yeah, so another question is related with collaborations. And the question is, do you see which organizational leadership level, whether it is the government, institutional, or departmental level and so on, are most likely to influence advancing the online collaborative education programs across nations in post-COVID era? Fulu or Tatiana? Was this something that
I want to address another question actually that you maybe skipped. It was from Edward regarding if there are any chapters in the book that exactly discussing the switch from the focus from international mobility to domestic enrollment. So I think that we actually covering it, and the examples of Australia and Japan and Germany was to read it. So just a comment on that. Yes, the answer is yes. So Fulu, you wanted to address the question that Aya was raising?
Okay, thank you, Aya. Well, look, approaches to online learning, the mode of learning in particular, are dictated for differently in different countries. In some countries, these are legislated practices, so that when higher education institutions do apply for accreditation of their programs, they are already upfront told that these are programs accredited for online learning or programs that are face-to-face. Will this change going forward? I strongly believe this is going to change, because what COVID has done now is enable countries and members of society to realize that higher education can be expanded to everyone much more easily than was the case pre-COVID. If I give you the example of South Africa for argument's sake, and I saw there was a question here, I think it's from Chris regarding funding models. So the funding models, model for argument's sake from South Africa's side was government released, out of COVID challenges, released a grant enabling all institutions to purchase learning devices for all students, implying therefore that all of our students are sitting online now. As we speak, a majority of our students, because we are on lockdown level 1, want to come back to campus. They are saying, can you please allow us to come to campus? And we're saying, well, you better stay there because you've got all the learning devices and the data. So I think these arrangements are going to continuously to be reimagined and remodeled. And indeed, in some instances, it will be the initiative of institutions. In some initiative, it will be a joint collaboration between government and higher education institutions, or the entire sector in particular. Thank you, Ayet.
Okay, thank you. I think we have a few minutes more. Let me quickly address a question from Professor Damdo, and then I'll throw in one very general question for both of you. The question was, if we have observed any pattern in increased involvement of the intellectual diaspora since the outbreak of the pandemic. This, unfortunately, was not something that we came across in this research, but from my knowledge in the subject, my other engagement is on this subject. I can say that at least for the case of Africa, yes, there has been an increased level of involvement from among the intellectual diaspora, which was expressed in a number of different ways. Organizing different events of engaging in research, in public conversations about the pandemic, and also trying to draw some lessons from the areas where they live, and then trying to get those across to their home countries. Involvement in the different governance structures and providing support, supporting online education, and also including mobilizing some resources in support of the response to the pandemic. So lastly, I would like to come to this broad idea of opportunities that was raised also by Edward, what are some of the opportunities that came out of the pandemic? We know that this has affected many people and institutions in a very drastic way, negatively, and we have plenty of information about the negative impact. But what are some of the positive things that came out or that could potentially come out going forward, having some positive influence on the way higher education is being done in different contexts?
Okay, let me give it a try. Yeah. To say that the relationship between government and higher education sectors and individual higher education institutions have completely been redefined. In some instances for the better, in other instances for the worse. So where it's been redefined for the better, I think it would be important to learn those lessons and find out if those lessons can be replicated in other countries. What are the other lessons that we learned? I personally think, and this is coming from the Global South and South Africa in particular, that had it not been for COVID, it would have taken us another decade or more for our students to catch up, not only our students, but for our universities to catch up with innovations and development in the space of online learning. And COVID has managed in a space of a few weeks, a few months to bridge that gap. And as we speak, I've given you a practical example. Every South African higher education institution learner has got a computer. They all have got data and they can sit wherever they can find connectivity and be able to engage with ease. But it also implies that we will need to find alternative mechanisms. And this responds to the question that Edward had put earlier on. Mechanisms to make sure that the quality of higher education provision under these circumstances and going forward remain of integrity, or that integrity is enhanced, so that the question of cheating and perhaps implementation of continuous learning, assessment methods becomes the norm. But of course, we will need to reimagine how we can get the learner much more engaged. And this is another practical example that online learning has managed to unleash. Higher education institution learners are able to engage more now than they would historically, because they can just type here on the system their questions, their comments, and everything, which they ordinarily were not doing in the face-to-face encounters. So there are quite a lot of opportunities that one would find if you look between the lines. You will be able to find those opportunities, but they differ by country, they differ by region, and they differ by institution. Thank you, Aye.
Thank you, Fulu. Tatiana, anything to add?
Yeah, I have a couple of points to add about the opportunities, right, and the positive things regarding the post-COVID situation and the adjustment to this spontaneous jump into the online teaching. So what we can observe as a conclusion from many chapters across the countries, of course, it's the improvement in technical skills of both students and faculty members. That's no doubt about it. Actually, introduction into the teaching process, learning process, some technologies, more reliability on available resources on YouTube, different video classes, and etc. That's for sure as an advantage. Also, there might be a little bit contradictory evidences, but
depending on the culture, some students becoming more engaged in online discussions because they are not afraid, or they have like better, like more comfortable, they're feeling more comfortable to engage in online discussions than rather in class, not to lose their faces. That's what we see, for example, in the UAE. So the online discussions are more vivid, and they feel free to discuss. Another story is the attraction or like involvement international faculties to teach, which was not possible economically wise, cost wise, for other institutions during the pre-pandemic world. So, but now it's possible because from any point in the world, the faculty members can access and give a lectures and etc. So I would say like involvement of the students in different conferences as well, because it's easier for the online, and involvement of the international faculty. So I think it's a more towards also the question about the collaboration and after the post-COVID period. So it definitely there would be more programs developed by the collaborative universities and international collaboration there. So that's at least 3 points that I wanted to add. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Tatiana. I think a couple of pointers I would probably add to this is that during the pandemic, many people turned to education. And so there was an increase in adult and lifelong learners who we generally consider non-traditional students, and that might have a lasting impact in terms of getting more people engaged in higher education. And that is actually one of the reasons why enrollment did not decrease in terms of total number in some of the places. You've talked about technology and the experiences that has been gained in terms of for both students and faculty, but also there is the investment aspect of it, that institutions are awakened that they have to invest in infrastructure, in technology. And also there is the policy aspect of it. For instance, in the case of Ethiopia and UAE, they came up with online learning policy. They didn't have any properly structured framework for how online education be conducted. But now, due to this, due to the pandemic, they have a policy framework that is established. Although there is a lot of changes to come into that it has to evolve with what is happening. And also some countries which had the policy but did not really have it in action, like Kazakhstan, which had a policy since 2005, but didn't have any online delivery of education. And so that was reinitiating those policies. So these are some of the positive impacts, but this is by no means an exhaustive list. Of course, the pandemic has taught us many things, and we hope that some of this will carry on going forward into influencing how higher education is done. So I think with this, we'll just finish our webinar, and I will give it back to Gerardo if you would like to take a moment for anything else, for housekeeping and anything. But on our part, we thank you very much. We are very grateful for CIHE, to CIHE for organizing this event, and we hope that we would have more engaged conversation in other events, and the book is planned to come out in the first months of 2022, and we hope that you would get it. Thank you very much.
Just to thank Ayu and our wonderful panelists for your participation. Thank you all for joining us. Take care, everyone.
Goodbye.